This week, we welcome novelist, screenwriter, and showrunner of my favorite show, Warrior, Jonathan Tropper.
First of all, there's been an overdue movement to expand which cultures are represented and how much can be expressed for every cultural, community across the country. So there's a lot more diversity, which also leads to segmentation. There's great crossover, like, shows like Beef, which it's been not one of the best shows to come out in the last few years, right? And it was largely, it was a story about Asian Americans, but it was also really a story about any of us, right? There was nothing specific. You could have made the same show and it not be Asian American, but there is a lot of segmentation where this group is going to watch their shows, this group is going to watch their shows. And that's both, by economic status, by racial status, by cultural status. So it is the side effect of representation is segmentation. And then what has to break through is representation that is universal. So it doesn't matter, who's on screen because the story is so universal.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join Phetasy.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at Phetasy.com. I'm with Jonathan Tropper, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome.
So excited to be here. Thanks.
I'm probably more excited to be talking to you since you are the showrunner of my favorite show, Warrior.
Yeah, although I should say for season 3, I have some other showrunners. Season 3, I took a half step back, and there are 2 other showrunners running it. But I'm obviously still incredibly involved. But yeah.
Do you want to shout out their names?
Yes, Evan Endicott and Josh Stoddard, who were writers on seasons 1 and 2. By the time we got to season 3, which was quite a bit later than it should have been, I was in a deal at Apple TV Plus, and therefore not allowed to officially be a showrunner of an HBO Max show. So I was allowed to still work for the show and contribute to the show and be part of the writer's room and write a script, but I couldn't be a showrunner because that would mean having to go spend months in Cape Town where we produced the show and, really spend too much time working on the show. So that Evan and Josh stepped up and really took over the show.
Wow. Yeah, the show has been on quite a journey itself. We just talk about I feel like it's this little show that could.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot and sort of like how sort of we've got sort of the spirit of Bruce Lee looking out for us and helping us win these fights. But, the history of the show is that Bruce Lee developed an idea, 50 years ago or so for a show that he would star in for Warner Brothers. And he pitched the show to them, and they didn't buy it. And largely, they said they can't imagine putting an Asian lead on the screen. They felt the lead no one would relate to an Asian lead, and this was 50 years ago, where that was just an acceptable answer. And coincidentally or not coincidentally, a year later, they came out with a show called Kung Fu, starring David Carradine playing a half Asian guy who's supposed to know Kung Fu, but also who clearly didn't. So that show was fairly successful for them. And it would always remain this really, bitter piece of Bruce Lee lore and something that his family always kind of, it was this lasting bad taste in their mouth that he never got to make that show. So then a few years ago, I was finishing a show for Cinemax called Banshee, and Justin Lin, who is a big Hollywood director, and who's a Taiwanese American, had also heard this story of the lost Bruce Lee treatment, and he contacted Shannon Lee, Bruce's daughter, who runs Bruce Lee Enterprises and who has sort of devoted her professional life to maintaining his legacy. And he asked her if that treatment existed, and he showed her that treatment. I didn't know either of them at this point, but she showed him the treatment. He got very excited about the treatment, and somehow they brought it over to the bosses at HBO Cinemax, who knew A, that I was winding down Banshee, and B, that I was a huge Bruce Lee fan. So they introduced me to Justin and Shannon. And I honestly don't ever remember actually sort of singing for my supper. Like, we all just started talking, and next thing I knew, I was writing the pilot. And
Wow.
and we made this show, and we got greenlit, um, and we did 2 seasons. And then the problem was, as we were doing our second season, Time Warner got bought by AT&T. And in that corporate merger, they basically shut down Cinemax as a place for original programming. And then they started HBO Max, but I couldn't get anyone at HBO Max to kind of pay attention to what we were doing over on Cinemax. They were busy developing their own stuff. So we just
Right.
died. We died on the vine. And, I think we were helped in a way by the pandemic, because the pandemic sort of froze everyone in place for a while. And the actors didn't all run off and join other shows, and everyone was still frozen in place. And so I began sort of quietly bugging Casey Bloys, the head of HBO, like, hey, can you put my 2 shows on Cinemax onto the HBO Max platform? They're just dying on Cinemax, because no one was subscribing to Cinemax, and Cinemax was dying. I'm like, please, like, that's 7 years of my life. Can you just get it onto the HBO Max platform? And ultimately, I guess because of the pandemic and because of the need for content, they started moving a few of the shows from Cinemax over to HBO Max. And so they moved Banshee, and they moved Warrior, and they moved, I think, The Nick, which was a great show as well. And Warrior did exceptionally well on the platform. And Casey sent me a little email saying, hey, the show's really doing well. And I just sent him back this email kind of tongue in cheek and said, well, we could always make more. And then he wrote back, can you really? And then Justin got involved, and Justin and I got onto this Zoom with Casey. And by the end of the Zoom, he was like, yeah, let's put it together. And so, like, we ended up making
Wow.
season 3 almost 3 years later. But we were able to get back
Wow.
almost the entire cast, and then we had to rebuild all our sets. We had to start from scratch again. But I think we came into it with a very excited energy, and it led to what I think is really our best season yet. It's a pretty great season, so worked out.
It's been such a great season.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
I found the show. I feel like I was watching it when it was on Cinemax, because I was always a Bruce Lee fan and had heard about this. And then found out that I follow Shannon on social media, and I think she was just promoting it and talking about it. And I was like, I have to go watch the show. And I couldn't believe that it wasn't like a cultural phenomenon. It seemed like one of those shows that everyone should have been talking about.
Yeah.
And
that's the problem with Cinemax. There were pros and cons with working for Cinemax. The pros were we had tremendous creative freedom. We had great support. The downside was that nobody subscribed to Cinemax. Like, if you're going to pay your subscription dollars with all the streamers, A, they had the old reputation of Cinemax, and B, they just didn't have the content the way if you have a choice between Netflix, Amazon Prime, HBO, and Cinemax, like, Cinemax just doesn't have it unless you're a hardcore kind of pulp action fan. So, we could do the best job in the world, and in the end, maximum 3 million people will see the show, right? And that was frustrating for me, because I literally did 2 shows on Cinemax, and I was so sick of being told I have the best shows nobody's watching. Like, I was like, I'd settle for a mediocre show that everybody's watching at this point. But so, like, thankfully we did finally prove it, because when they moved our stuff over to a big platform, it's performed really well, and that's why we're making more Warrior and Banshee. Banshee's past its due date, but, like, it's nice that that's gotten a whole new audience now, and just being on a major platform makes a huge difference. So
yeah, it does. It makes a very big difference. I've been really fascinated with the kind of OnlyFans pivot to original content that they're attempting at the moment.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
And so they're starting kind of in the comedy world. So my friend Whitney Cummings, she produced the roast of Bert Kreischer, her own roast. She has some original content. They seem to be trying. They have OnlyFans TV, and I just, I applaud the expansion. I just always wonder if you can get out from under that. It's like the Cinemax problem.
Yeah, and I think also, they're expanding at a time when the rest of the industry is going to contract really hard. Even if
Yeah.
the strikes weren't forcing it, the industry was about to go through a major consolidation. And so it's odd to
Interesting.
sort of say now's a great time to get into the content business, because now's the time when I think over the next few years, the big guys are going to swallow each other up and we'll be left with, three streamers. Something like that's going to happen because there's just been way too much content being made, way too much television shows being made. um, yeah, people can't find them all. And on the other hand, what's happened in, I guess, a fractured industry is there, if you can carve out a little niche for yourself and figure out the business model, people will find you. So it might be that
Right.
we're no longer, we all still, I certainly come from the age of water cooler television, right? Where everyone's watching the same show and everyone's talking about what happened last night, on Seinfeld,
Right.
or back in the day, I can't even think of what the shows were, but there were big shows everybody was watching. And it feels like the last show that was like that was Game of Thrones. That was sort of the last show that everybody was watching. Um, and it'd be nice to get back in some ways to those shows that cut through and everybody's watching. And at the same time, for upstart streamers, there's always, if you could figure out your niche, there's probably a little pocket for you if you've got a built-in subscriber base.
Yeah, and I think it returns us to the kind of wild west that we've been in of no gatekeepers, that it returns us a little bit to the highly gate kept model of producing content.
Yeah, I don't. It's such a wild card of what this is, what the industry is going to look like after the strike. Um, I mean, I've only experienced gatekeeping because I've only worked for HBO and now Apple TV Plus, and they do still run. Whether they're streamers or not, they run the same way the networks ran back when they were networks, back when they were cable, back when it was
Interesting.
broadcast. There's still that same. You got to get through the executives. You got to pitch the show. You got to get through the different levels of executives up to the big bosses. Then you got to do proof of concept. The one thing that's changed is the economic model of pilots has changed. So we're not really shooting pilots anymore. Generally, at least in my experience, when your show gets ordered, they put you through the gauntlet first, but then they order the season. They don't make you shoot a pilot and then spend time testing a pilot to see if they're going to go ahead with the series. That may still be going on
Right.
broadcast network, but but yeah, there's definitely been overall throughout the industry some of the best TV we've ever seen, and also a tremendous drop in quality control at the same time. So like great stuff and horrible stuff are all getting on the air at the same time. And it's, in a sense, it's very democratic, except that with the streamers, you don't really get a sense of what's succeeding because nobody gives you the data, right? Like we're just now beginning to start to have certain devices to be able to tell what's performing, but they'll never give you proprietary data, which makes it really hard to know what's a huge success, right?
What's their reason for not giving that data?
Well, nobody wants to show that they suck, right? So they'll always release exciting data if it's a hit, right?
Right.
Um, I have a movie on Netflix that is, they keep putting out, it's the third most watched movie on Netflix ever. And and that's super exciting. But, I also have a movie on Netflix that nobody watches. And I don't get any data about that. So
What's
it's
the
just,
third most watched movie?
it's a movie I wrote called The Adam Project, which is on
Oh,
Netflix.
okay.
It's like a family sci-fi adventure starring Ryan Reynolds. That was directed by Sean Levy. That performed really well there. But most of what I have on Netflix doesn't fall into that category, and you would have no idea how well it's doing or not. And I think they want to keep that data to themselves because otherwise people know what bombs, right? Where I live, everybody talks about Succession, right? And people love Succession. My guess is across the middle of America, not a lot of people watch Succession.
Yeah, it's
So
interesting. On the plane yesterday, there was a woman sitting next to me from my middle seating coach, and she was sending Succession memes to I just looked at her, she was texting, and it was like a Succession meme in Spanish. So because
wow.
before we took out, and I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I was like, I wonder what the Latin population is that like enjoyed Succession. I would love to see those numbers.
Or the farmers in the middle of America. I can't
Yeah.
imagine they're watching Succession, right? How does that speak to them, right?
I think,
it really feels like a coastal show, but
yeah,
I could be wrong. I'll never know.
I think
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
I feel like Andrew Schultz, I think it was him who was talking recently about the comedian. He was talking recently about why it's like a double-edged sword. And I think somebody wrote an article about this, that the streamers, that for writers and directors and content creators and actors, they might not actually want to know what the numbers are, because then it would mean less stuff gets made. And if you're asking for a piece of the pie might be smaller than you think it is. If you actually knew these numbers, it all feels a little bit like a Ponzi scheme. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. The Nielsen system was the thing we all sort of were raised on, and there were hits and there were misses, and there were things that were sort of on the bubble. And I mean, I think you still get a sense from whether it's a streamer or a cable, like you still get a sense if your show's successful or not. Um, because they see the data and they get excited, and if the data is bad, they're not going to pick you up for another season, right? If the data
Right.
is good, if you're getting picked up, someone's watching your show. It's just harder to gauge because there are so many more shows. Like it used to be, if you had a hit show, everyone was talking about the show, right? And now everyone's talking about different shows they're watching, and there are so many subsets of hit shows and on different platforms and for different fan bases. It's hard to know. Like Witcher is a huge hit. I haven't watched Witcher, but there is a very dedicated fan base that does, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with my show, Warrior. Like Warrior is a hit on Max. It's doing really well, but it's also not universal, right? There are a lot of people who won't turn into a show that they perceive to be a martial arts show, right? Now, I
Weird.
believe, I feel the show is, a lot more than a martial arts show, but because we have the Bruce Lee name and because there is a big focus of martial arts within the show, I think that there's a whole set of viewers who would watch, let's say, Peaky Blinders, which is kind of a similar show, but aren't that interested in watching Warrior because it's gung fu, right? But so I don't even know how you measure audiences anymore. For me, as a
Interesting.
writer and a producer, I do want to know if I'm successful or not, because you want to know if you can bank on the show coming back, and you want to know if
Right.
you're going to be able to keep doing business with that. With that platform, are they going to want to renew my overall deal? Are they going to want more shows from me? So I think it's always good to know. But just as in the old days with the movie business, there was somehow, no matter if you had a percentage of the net, you never got, somehow the most successful movies in the world never had a net profit because of the way they do the accounting. I'm sure there's also ways to manage the data so the data can say whatever they needed to say. So you're kind of at
Right.
their mercy
Right.
in that regard, you know.
Right. It is like, does it break through the cultural zeitgeist? Like
Right.
Succession seemed to be, because it was kind of this cultural coastal elite show, the people who are in media were all watching it and talking about it. And so it had this appearance of being maybe much larger than it actually was.
But we all live in echo chambers, right? So, like, if you went into my socials, you would think Warrior is the biggest show on TV, right? Because of because the people who follow me are all posting about it, and people start following me because they're watching it, and I'm connected
Yeah.
to all of the actors, and so we all the followers. But if you just take one step away from that, we don't exist, right? And so it's hard to know. We all live in these echo chambers of like, that's the biggest show around, except nobody west of New Jersey has watched. So
Yeah, that's
it's hard to
interesting.
know.
I feel like what you're talking about really points to this sense that I've had lately of everything being broken. And I don't know that everything's broken. I just feel, I was trying to describe it. I'm like, it feels like a mirror that's been shattered, and there's a million reflections and light bouncing off everywhere, but it doesn't feel whole to me. And I don't know how, I cannot find a way to articulate this
Yeah, but
eloquently.
I think what's happened is the combination of technology and social media has stripped away a veneer, which, by the way, might have just been bullshit. But there was a veneer when we were all watching the same three networks, and then there was HBO, right? the world, and there were only like, I don't know what the number was. Let's say 40 or 50 shows, right? So we were all kind of, I mean, the amount of people who tuned into Friends and Seinfeld and Cheers and whatever those big shows were, those were real
Roseanne.
numbers, right? MASH,
Yeah.
Roseanne, right? Like
Yeah.
those were gigantic shows, and you could safely assume they were cultural touchstones across the country, right? And you
Yeah.
just and maybe that created so there was a real sense that we were all digesting the same entertainment, we were all digesting the same stuff culturally, right? And now two things have happened. First of all, is there's been an overdue movement to expand which cultures are represented and how much can be expressed for every cultural community across the country. So there's a lot more
Yeah.
diversity, which also leads to segmentation, and that's there's
Yeah.
great crossover, like shows like Beef, which it's been not one of the best shows to come out in the last few years, right? And it was largely, it was a story about Asian Americans, but it was also really a story about any of us, right? There was nothing specific. You could have made the same show and it not be Asian American. The Asian American cultural stuff in it added texture to it, and it was great. But it wasn't a barrier to viewership, right? But there is a lot of segmentation where this group is going to watch their shows, this group is going to watch their shows, and that's both by economic status, by racial status, by cultural status. So it is, I guess not the downside to representation, but the side effect of representation is segmentation, and then what has to break through is representation that is universal. So it doesn't matter, who's on screen, because the story is so universal, right? And that's why, that's why, like, stories like Black Panther, right? Which, that was a great moment for the African American community, but that's also a movie everyone could watch, right? And everyone could get excited about. And and I think of Warrior in the same thing. Sure, it's a large Asian American cast, and it's a large Asian cast, and it's a story about the Chinese American immigration, but it's in America. It's a story about America. And so it shouldn't just be a show for Asian Americans. It should be a show for everybody. But I think the more we make and the more specialized we get, the more segmented we get. And so it does feel like, and also everyone wants to get in the business. So there's so many places to watch, and there's just really, in a sense, too many shows for any one person to absorb. So we're then absorbing. I'm watching different things than you're watching. It used to be we could all count on the fact that we've probably watched at least one of the same shows, right?
Yeah.
Or we've seen one of the same movies or something. And now that's a lot harder. And that's why I think Top Gun Maverick did what it did. It was like, the first time in a long time that like everybody went to the movie theater to see the same movie,
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Barbie seems
it's
to
hard
have
to know
kind
how
of
to
done
feel
that in a
about it.
weird way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have considered myself the target market for Barbie. And, my wife and I went to the movie because my wife wanted to see it. And I actually found myself incredibly moved by the movie. And, I think, I think the more we can get, and my only hope about this whole consolidation of the TV business and this strike is that it does ultimately lead to a resurgence in theatrical movies. Everyone's making a big deal about Barbenheimer now, but it'd be great if like it became viable again to be making a lot of movies for the theatrical experience again, because I think we lose something when that stops happening.
I was reading that theater's dying too. Just like the live theater world is dying all over America. And that's, to me, coming up through theater is so vibrant and important. But I also seem to see my own kind of anecdotal experiences that people are turning more back to real life experiences again. And they're craving them and thirsting them. And that's something that you just can't virtualize that. You can try, but it's just not the same as going to a festival and being bumped around by people and inhaling marijuana smoke and standing in line and being hot, or going to a movie and everyone's dressed up like they did back in the Harry Potter movies, and now Barbie, we see this. I don't know. There's something that just I'm excited about. I've seeing what Joe Rogan has done with Mothership and Austin. Like, the crowds are insane. The lines, people want to see live comedy again. I think people are like recovering from this. What is it called when you don't want to leave the house? Agoraphobic
Yeah,
mentality that everybody
I
got.
was going to say anything that people are willing to experience that takes them off their phones and off their devices and out of the house, I think does better for us culturally. Whether it's movie theaters, whether it's Broadway theaters, whether it's comedy clubs, whether it's concerts, like anything that you can experience communally and viscerally and not through a device, I think, I just somehow think it's better for us as a culture and for humanity to just be
Hmm.
doing things together. Otherwise, it starts to feel like
Yeah.
the pandemic felt like an Asimov novel. Like I forgot the name of the novel. Asimov wrote a novel where humans didn't even have contact with each other anymore. They all just lived in these pods, and like we lived through that in the pandemic. And I would think everyone would have come rushing back. I certainly came rushing back, but for some people, it became like, hey, I kind of like this better. So
Yeah, it was like the rise
yeah,
of the introverts. They
yeah,
had their moment, but I do think it
yeah.
is even traveling. I just had to recently do kind of a whirlwind trip, and it's summer and everybody's out, and it was insane at the Atlanta airport. The last time
Oh
I was at
yeah,
the Atlanta airport, I was going to South Africa actually during the pandemic, and it was during the South African strain. So there was like nobody
nobody.
going to South
Yeah,
Africa. And there was no one traveling, and I was at Atlanta, and I think it was the first time I had been in Atlanta in a long time, and it was empty. And I'm mad at myself for not taking videos because when I was there this past weekend, I was like, "Oh my god, busiest airport in the world!" And it's just madness there right now. But just seeing, I was walking through the crowd, thinking like, "This is good for us." We need to like.
yeah.
It's
I mean,
like
it'd be nice
we
if,
need
if
to
the
bump
airlines
into
got their
each
acts
other.
together, but
Yeah,
definitely,
no, I
like
know.
yeah, every time, even still now when we go out to restaurants, because I'm a social person, I really started to get very depressed, like a lot of people during the pandemic, just missing interaction with people. And now we'll be out in a crowded restaurant, and I'll still get a moment where I'll be like, I'll remind myself about me sitting with my beard upstate New York, wondering if we'll ever have this again. Like,
Uh-huh.
will we ever be in restaurants again with people? And like, so now when I'm there, I still have a moment of appreciation for like, hey, we came out the other side of this. You
Yeah,
know,
and it's almost
we
like it never
mishandled the
happened, which
shit
is
out of
weird.
it, but we came out the other side of it.
Yeah. Like it's very
Uh,
strange to me how we just like
yeah,
suddenly it was over, like nothing
yeah.
happened and we weren't all locked in our
We, and
houses, but okay.
yeah, we also proved as a nation how utterly inept we are. And like, I mean, it wasn't just us, it was a lot of countries, but really just the whole myth that like the government's got this. When I think all of us, an interesting side effect of that is we'll never really feel safe again, because if the next thing comes, whatever it is, that we are not up to the task, you know?
Yeah, and
Um,
I was kind of
yeah.
saying during the pandemic, I was like, maybe it's truly that it like not enough people are dying. Like it wasn't as bad as we were made to
Right. If it
believe,
had
and
been
you
a
could
little
see
worse,
that because, which sounds horrible. A lot of people died, and I don't want to minimize that, but it wasn't like the Black Plague when 1 out of 4 people you knew were dying. It was a lot more mild.
the thing that happened was the initial belief was this doesn't affect kids, right?
Mm,
And because if you remember when COVID first started, they were all saying it doesn't seem to really affect kids, right? If it came out of the gate affecting kids, everyone would have just locked down, right? It's like,
right.
but there was that chink in the armor where it doesn't affect kids. And then by the time it was affecting kids, everyone was already sort of over it because there was the fighting about masking and there was the fighting about vaccines and there was all the fact that it all got politicized. I think is the saddest thing of the whole thing, because you just look at Europe and how countries still seem to be able, and European countries still somehow seem to be able to pull together sometimes, or small countries, and we're just a country that can't pull together anymore. And that's sort of the takeaway from the pandemic, was that like the government doesn't have our back and we can't quite pull together ourselves. So good luck to us. You know, yeah.
That seems very
Not to bring you
American to me,
down.
though.
Yeah.
No, there's something about that spirit that feels like uniquely American, however, as much as that, like, no one is coming. You know, there's that sense of, I've been reading
Yeah.
a lot of just about like the Texas history being here, and I'm like, this state's history is bananas. And
Yeah.
it is very much, even what I love about Warrior, I'm obsessed with those, the like that time in our country when we were expanding, the anything about the
Frontier.
transcontinental
Yeah.
rail. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
that is kind of in our DNA. And that was that his original pitch? Did it take place in the was it a period?
Yeah, he wanted it to take place during the times of the Tong Wars in San Francisco. Um, and his desire for that, I'm sure, had to do also with, he was a Chinese American who, Bruce Lee faced a lot of racism, coming to America and trying to build a movie star career in a country that didn't really want movie stars that didn't look like, the majority of the country. So he faced a lot of racism in his life, working, in restaurants, teaching martial arts. Like, he had the kind of personality that seemed to be able to transcend that and to charm his way past it. But it was very meaningful to him. And so I think, the time just after the gold rush, when the Chinatowns had formed and everything was still raw and the Chinese were being treated so horribly, I think that to him was an interesting time to build a hero. And the second thing was, it was always important to him to set a show. And there are interviews online of him saying this. He needs to set it in this time period because it needed to be a time period before everyone's got a gun. Because he's saying once everyone's got a gun, you really can't do a martial arts show because, they'll just shoot you. So even though we have guns in Warrior, we have very few guns. And the notion is that when people get into scraps on the street, they're fights, they're not gunfights. So it was that the time period was very good for martial arts. And it was also a really good time to explore, the anti-Chinese sentiment that, pervaded the country, which is really just an anti-immigrant sentiment, which is a really interesting thing to study in a country that's literally built by immigrants. So like you're an immigrant until the next wave of immigrants come, and then you're like, get rid of those immigrants. We're the real Americans. Yeah, it's like when freshmen become sophomores and start hazing the freshmen. It's like, you don't. Where's your sympathy? Where's the empathy? So, and there's a huge.
That's what's interesting about the Irish in this show.
Yeah. And the Irish were more easily accepted because of the Irish looked like the Irish looked like the original British who came, right? So like if you looked Anglo, you already were a step up, right? When the Italians immigrated to New York, they had a big problem because they were darker. They were darker skinned, and there was tremendous racism against Italians in New York when they first showed up. And so just all around, like, the trick was looking European, right? If you didn't look European, strike one. And then it was also, if you're undercutting the labor, that's going to be a huge problem. And so, and all that's driven by the European money and power. All the money, all the people in positions of wealth are looking for the lowest costs, right? So they're undercutting their own labor forces by importing labor and then creating these huge immigration problems. And so this country's never quite figured out what its relationship is with immigrants.
Yeah, still. That's what's so interesting watching it, is how many of the themes just transcend time in this country.
Yeah, I mean, that show's taking place in 1878, and with a few little flourishes that could be happening today. And when we started doing the show, I started writing the show before Trump was running. I think Trump had not yet declared his that he was running for president. And by the time the show aired, I think Trump was president. And so immigration had become a really hot topic. But when I was writing the show and when we were developing the show, it wasn't such a hot topic. And then it instantly became super relevant because of, him wanting to build a wall and all the border stuff and all the immigration arguments in Congress. And we have a show that shows sort of the root of it when the Chinese were immigrating to America. The Exclusion Act was a law that was voted in by Congress in 1882. It's the only time
Okay.
in this country that there was actual legislation against a particular race of people immigrating to America. And the
Wow.
Exclusion Act of 1882 said that, the Chinese couldn't come to America anymore. And that's the only time this country's done it. And it was largely about, I think, it was, the arguments were about the labor force, right? How they were undercutting the labor force, but it was really xenophobia because they didn't look like us and they didn't seem to be like us, and people were just, turned off by them. It was a lot of xenophobia, and so we purposely set the show a few years before the Exclusion Act just to sort of be able to set it in the kind of the building political tensions of the fact, of what they were calling the Chinese problem.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I am woefully ignorant and did not even know about the Exclusion Act until
I
I
didn't
was
either.
watching the show.
That was what was amazing is I had never, one part of the reasons I jumped onto the show is I'd never done a period piece. And, I started doing research into what it was like in Chinatown in the 1870s. And the first thing I discovered is how little there is to find, because American history doesn't really talk about it, right? American history doesn't talk about their mistreatment of the Chinese during the gold rush and the building of the railroad. The business people lured the Chinese over with promises of gold, promises of wealth, and then basically turned them into indentured servants who couldn't afford the trip home. So it was a horrible experience. And then they set up these Chinatowns, and they became ghettos. And it was just a
Right.
terrible time it was a terrible time in Chinese American history. But because it's not Chinese history, and Americans didn't treat it like American history, it's neglected in the history books. It's neglected in history classes. And the way we researched it, I was still finishing up Banshee, and my wife spent days in libraries finding articles, letters, correspondence, records of lawsuits and legal proceedings. And we had to sort of piece it together that way because the Chinese Americans in Chinatown didn't really keep records. And then there was also a big
Wow.
fire in 1903, San Francisco Chinatown, that wiped out whatever records there were. So it's all done with there's 3 pages in someone's travelogue about Chinatown, San Francisco here. And then, there's a book called The Barbary Coast that talks about Chinatown briefly here, but you have to do it in fits and starts because there's no book to read about it. It's just a lot of little pieces everywhere. But I didn't know a thing about it.
Interesting.
And it was just revelatory to me to learn sort of, and you really do see how systemic the xenophobia is built into the government and built into the economics of our country, how it's designed to both, bring them in and spit them out. And it's fascinating to see that it hasn't changed.
Yeah, I love the style of the show because it does feel historically grounded, and yet there's kind of like a graphic novel vibe to it with the costumes. Yeah. And by the way, I love the way you guys handle the language stuff where when they're speaking to each other, it's English, but then when they're speaking to someone who doesn't speak Mandarin, it sounds broken.
Yeah, it's Cantonese.
How did you decide or Cantonese? Sorry.
Yeah.
How did you decide to do it that way?
So we had a lot of talks about the language. The first thing we wanted to do is we didn't want there to be a barrier between the viewers and the protagonists of our show, right? So if they were speaking Cantonese with subtitles, they already feel one step removed, right? And we wanted you, regardless of your ethnicity and nationality, to relate to the protagonists of our show. So we wanted them speaking American sounding English. So we basically ripped off and developed further a device from a movie called The Hunt for Red October, where Sean Connery plays a Russian submarine captain. And in the first few lines of the movie, he's speaking Russian, and then they switch to English, but you understand he's really speaking Russian, but now it's like someone's put a universal translator into your ear, right? So that's what we did for the show. Is we start out very briefly with them speaking Cantonese to each other, and then we do a camera move around their head, and it merges into English. So you understand they're speaking Cantonese, but you can understand it, and you don't have to go with subtitles. And then the fun is, if they're speaking in front of any non-Chinese person, they hear Cantonese. So depending on where the camera is, if we're in their point of view, we're going to hear English, but if we're in a policeman's point of view, we're going to hear Cantonese. And it also, that's a great way of also establishing the barrier between the white people and the Chinese people at that time. So the language just became a really great device to sort of both avoid the barrier for the viewer and also emphasize the barrier, within the show. And
No,
the
it's
graphic,
it's
not, yeah,
genius the way you guys did that.
yeah. Thanks. I always say, like, we didn't make it up, like we did steal it from The Hunt for Red October, but they just did it at the very beginning of the movie, and we used it throughout the show. And the graphic novel design was really important to me when I first took on the show for two reasons. First of all, I knew I was going to be making it on a Cinemax budget. And so making that show for $3.5 million an episode, I knew I couldn't build the Merchant Ivory version of the show, right? Like, I wasn't going to have huge sweeping vistas and huge drone shots. Like, I just wasn't going to be able to afford to build the kind of sets and world that a true historical docudrama would build, right?
Hmm.
So by making it more of a graphic novel feel, we built a very big backlot. We built like 6 blocks of Chinatown, but we were able to build it in a certain way where you accept a slightly more colorful and a slightly more confined set, because the whole aesthetic is a hyper surreal graphic novel formula, which is why, like, we have our gangsters wearing Armani suits. Nobody wore suits like that in the 1870s. And
Right.
the Long Z, the rival Tom, wears these long Western duster coats, which look almost like a post-apocalyptic cowboy movie. And we took liberties with the wardrobe to basically plant our flag and say, we're going to base this on history, but we are not going to be tied to historical fact. So the show takes liberties, anachronistic liberties, and also, we'll decide. Like, at the end of season 2, we did a big riot in San Francisco Chinatown. That riot per se never happened, but riots like that happened in other California Chinatowns and in New York. And so we sort of would take historical information and kind of meld it together. But because we do this show with that sort of fun Tarantino-ish tone and that graphic novel feel, we're basically saying you're not going to hold us to any exact historical facts. Like, we might change some dates. We might say something that happened in 1873, we're going to say happened in 1878, and things like that. But we're thematically very true to history, but our style gives us a little license to play with it and make it more
Yeah, but
entertaining.
it also feels like Bruce Lee. He was so style, he had such a style about him and all of
Yeah.
his movies, and he was obsessed with the look of something. And I'm just I'm like a 12-year-old kid in the 80s level fan of Bruce Lee. I took
Yeah.
Jeet Kune Do for a while. My friends
Oh,
were like,
wow.
"Are you like a 13-year-old boy?" I studied
Yeah.
the guy was like truly just one in billions of
Yeah.
people, just a complete original. The way that even when he broke his back and was laid up for a year, he read every philosophical work he possibly could. The guy just soaked up life in a way that it's just unbelievable. His drive and focus and thirst for knowledge and his whole philosophy of being like water that he came up with. He's just, I'm such a fan. I'm
Yeah,
like a
he was
super
he was a
fan.
brilliant guy, and the other thing he had an innate understanding of is, having come from Hong Kong cinema, which was a very different kind of martial arts cinema, and then watching the spaghetti westerns and watching American movies, and knowing John Wayne and Steve McQueen and all those heroes. He understood that there was a certain cowboy swagger to American cinema that didn't exist, that didn't have a counterpart in Chinese cinema, in the Hong Kong cinema. And he created a sort of sense of swagger to his characters in his movies that was more akin to a Western ethos than an Eastern ethos, which is why he so badly wanted to break in here. But when we
Hmm.
were sort of talking about everything, I said to every director and every actor, like, and our production designers and our costume designers, like, the word I came up with that basically summarized, the intelligence and the fun and the entertainment value of Bruce Lee was swagger. And so, when I spoke to Koji, who plays Asama, our lead actor, like, the most important thing for him to understand was, we're not asking you to try to imitate Bruce Lee, right? Don't try to move like him. Don't try to be like him. That's a losing battle, right?
Yeah.
But just figure out how to have swagger. We got to shoot the show with swagger. The score has to have swagger. The set, it just has to feel like there's a huge entertainment value. And in a sense, almost Bruce Lee always was a little bit winking at the camera, right? He was always like, look what I'm serving up for you. And so we've kind of incorporated that too. And so it was great to have him as the sort of, not just the inspiration for the facts of the show, but the inspirations for how to tone the show.
Yeah. And the lead, Koji, is when I was watching him over, even in particularly like this season, he has like a John Wayne vibe. There's just something effortlessly cool about him that comes through, and it's not like he's imitating Bruce Lee. It's cool, like his own thing.
No, he's nothing like Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
No, he was a huge discovery for us. We were ready to push production because we couldn't find our lead. It was really hard to find someone to play that part. And Andrew, when we cast him, had done almost nothing. He'd done some plays and he'd done some bit parts, and he was basically about to quit acting. Like, I think he was living in his father's basement. He was depressed. He was like overacting. He was thinking it was time to try something else. And his mother talked him into putting himself on tape for the audition. And he put himself on tape in his garage with his mother reading the lines back to him. And, we saw that tape, and he didn't look the part. He didn't feel the part, but there was something in his audition that was there was this smoldering quality to him that we felt like it feels like there's a leading man in there, and so we brought him from England to LA to sort of do it for us in person. And it was Justin Lin, myself, Shannon Lee, and Danielle Woodrow, who was the other executive producer on season 1. And like the minute he walked out of the room, we all just kind of looked at each other and said, like, that's the guy. And he was out of shape. He hadn't been working in a while. And in the time between when we cast him and when we showed up in Cape Town, he threw himself into training in like a way I've never seen. Like, he showed up to season 1, super cut, super athletic already. The stunt guys had put him in touch with some trainers, already looking like a real martial artist. Like, he hadn't done martial arts in so many years. He just saw like, this is my shot, and he took it, and he basically became the heart of the show.
Wow. He also has a little bit of a James Dean vibe too, that smoldering thing that you mentioned. He's sexy for sure.
The first time he put on the suit on set and he was kind of walking down our fake Chinatown street, I was sitting with Justin Lin, and we were just looking at him, and he was like, he's James Bond. Like, he just looked so smooth and so cool and so on point. I'm like, he's just like James Bond. Like, it was really cool.
He should be the next James Bond.
Yeah.
How did you get into this industry?
Sort of in a roundabout way. I was a novelist for 10 years, and I'd written, I'd written 6 novels, and my novels were always getting optioned by Hollywood studios, and then the movies were never getting made. And I was always curious, like, if you're optioning it, why is it so hard to get it made? And I started to ask to see the scripts that were being generated. And I would read the scripts and I'd be like, well, this doesn't seem that hard. I feel like I could do this. And so a handful of producers, after some of my books got optioned in bizarre kind of auctions, like bidding wars between studios, which was never so much a function of the book itself, but like there was a point where I wrote a book and Tobey Maguire wanted to option it for his company. And at the time he was playing Spider-Man for Sony, and they didn't want to disappoint him, so they threw tremendous money at the end. Suddenly we had this huge bidding war going on, and like I was lucky. I had a few lucky breaks where my books were optioned for a lot more money than they would have otherwise, especially because of a certain dynamic that had nothing to do with me. So I started meeting with producers, and they would say to me, you should really try to write screenplays. You write really good dialogue, try screenplays. And so when I felt ready, I kind of had my literary agent connect me with a lit agent out in Hollywood, like for screenwriting. And I got my first job, which was to write a remake of the old play Harvey by Mary Chase, which had been a movie in 1950 starring Jimmy Stewart. And so they had the rights to it, and they wanted to do an updated version of it. And I wrote a kind of really different sort of updated version of Harvey. And in sort of that fairy tale way, somebody gave that to Spielberg, and he really liked the script, and so he decided he was going to direct it. So then I spent a bunch of time working with him on the script, and I was sure it was going to
Wow.
get made. I'm like, wow, Steven Spielberg found my script. Like, this is easy. And then, of course, the movie fell
Yeah.
apart. Um, but Steven,
This is
who's
a
an
classic
incredibly
Hollywood tale.
yeah, I was so sure I had it made. Like, Steven was like going to
Yeah.
make the movie, and then the movie fell apart. But Steven made some introductions for me and got me my next few jobs, and like it just, I had sort of this stink of respectability because I'd worked with Spielberg. So then I got a few more jobs, but what I was trying to do was get a kind of movie made that nobody was really making anymore, which was sort of the Jim Brooks, Cameron Crowe type of movies, like Jerry Maguire, or Terms of Endearment, movies like that. And Hollywood had just kind of stopped making those movies, so I started pitching them as TV shows, and nobody would buy them. I kept getting invited into HBO to pitch because someone at HBO really liked my books. So I would pitch TV shows in the vein of my books, which were sort of, comical lit fiction in a way. And I couldn't
Hmm.
sell a damn thing. And then, just sort of almost on a whim, I'd had this idea since high school, based on the Count of Monte Cristo, about a cop who's really a criminal who stole an identity and is posing as a cop. And so I put that together with another writer, David Schickler, and we pitched it, and they bought it in the room. And suddenly I
Wow.
was writing genre television, and it was the first show Cinemax ever did. And the show was successful. We did 4 seasons, and at the same time, I was still selling features and trying to get features made. And I adapted my own novel, which actually became a movie called This Is Where I Leave You. So that sort of got me into the feature side of things, and it just sort of grew from there. But I somehow accidentally ended up in genre television for about 10 years because Banshee led to Warrior. And then when Warrior was canceled, I ended up doing this show for Apple TV Plus called C, starring Jason Momoa, which is a big action show set in the post-apocalyptic future. And it was like, before I looked, it had been like 8 or 9 years, and I'd been doing action TV. And so now I'm doing action movies now, but I'm trying to shift TV over to something a little more literary. And so my next TV show, the show I'm working on now, which I hope will be my next show, doesn't have guns and fights and action. It's much more of a contemporary show about, middle-aged men screwing up their lives. So
Oh,
we'll
okay.
see.
Like
We'll
30
see.
something? Like in
Well,
the
yeah, except this would
vein
be
of
more
30
like
something?
late 40s, 50 something. But yeah, it's kind of
Yeah,
about
yeah.
it's sort of about the crumbling of the sort of upstate New York 1%er communities. So we'll see if I can get that one on. But I'm trying to, but that's how I got into the business. And so now, I feel lucky because I get to work on the feature side and on the TV side. But it's also
Yeah.
just trying to start to do stuff that's a little more meaningful to me now. I mean, Warrior was incredibly meaningful to me, but it's also just, 8 years of doing genre shows. And I love genre, but I'd like to kind of spread my wings a little bit and do something else.
I am always so fascinated
Yeah.
how people end up in the business, and showrunning is really, it seems like its own, I don't know, it feels like you have to have a different kind of talent for that too, because you have to kind of balance the business aspect with the.
I was fortunate in that because I didn't make a living as a novelist till well into my 30s. I had run a business for a while, and I had managed people, and I had dealt with people,
Mm,
and that helps. But it's also the kind of thing where you can only learn it on the job. There's no other way. You learn it on the job, and if you're lucky, there are other people working on your show who will teach you without resenting you. Like when I did Banshee, I had never run a show before, and
hmm.
we hired HBO hired a producing director, Greg Utanis, who'd been producing and directing television for 20 years. So really, he was running the show because I didn't know what I was doing. Right, I was handling the scripts and everything else he was doing, but he didn't act like just stay in your lane and let me do this. He actually really made it a point to teach me. And so by the time we got
Right.
to season 2, I was running a lot more of the show that I had in season 1, and by season 3, I was running the show. And so, but it's definitely an acquired skill that there's no school for, really. You just have to be thrown into it and figure it out. and just be really nice to everybody, because you need everybody. You need every single person on the crew and every single writer. And like, if you go in and treat people like they're expendable, I think you're going to fail very quickly, because people have to people are there's literally 150 to 200 people there to serve your vision. And why the fuck should they do that if you're an asshole, So you have to be
exactly.
You have to recognize that you couldn't do it without every single one of them. I think that's the real trick of the showrunner.
What do you think in terms of the strike? What are your feelings as it kind of drags on? Do you think it'll be resolved quickly?
Well, I think the ship has sailed on a quick resolution, because we're already going into our third month here, right?
Well, the last writer's strike was 100 days? It was long.
Well, we're going to pass that, I think. I haven't been keeping tally, but I think we might be there already on the writer's side. Look, if you speak to 50 writers, you're going to get 50 opinions. And the other thing that you have to be really sensitive of is the life of a rank and file TV writer is very different from the life of a showrunner, and the things, the protections needed aren't the same. We all can agree we're fighting for residuals. We're fighting, against artificial intelligence. We're fighting against a lot of the same things. But the other thing is, there's places where our needs diverge, and it's just unfortunate that the studios are so beholden to shareholders and stock prices that there's no consideration of the humanity. Because if there was just even like a 10%, hey, what if we made very slightly less, but we were human about this, right? I feel like it's not that hard to crunch these numbers and figure out what to do. There's some thorny issues, but there's stuff that can be done. And I think everyone's dug in really hard right now, and it's because of stock prices and shareholders, and that's just where the business has gone. And I don't know how this gets resolved. It doesn't feel like everyone's waiting for the other person to cry uncle, and I don't know who cries uncle first.
I don't really understand any of it. I certainly don't understand from the studio side how I guess they just, they stockpile content anyway. They probably know exactly how long they can go. I'm sure if they aren't coming back to the table, they'll come back when they need to.
There's no version already where there isn't going to be some kind of lull. A year from now or a year from now, there's going to be a weird little gap in content where you're going to be like, why is there so much shit being played? Oh, yeah, this is because there was nothing being put in the pipeline a year ago for the strike. And I don't know how this ends. It's deeply upsetting to everyone involved. And I haven't spoken to any writers who aren't deeply depressed about it and outraged and frustrated. And it's hard. It's really hard. It's hard because we can't control any of it. It's almost like you want to see a whole other set of studios pop up who say, hey, we're going to handle this differently and let's go. But, and also most of the people I work with at the studios, they're not villains, right? They feel this way too. This is all being handled way above everybody's heads. And it's all about stock prices and bottom lines. And the other problem is the AMPTP itself are a group of disjointed companies that no longer have the same business models. Like you have Apple and Amazon, for whom content is not their core competency. Then you have Netflix, who makes stuff around the world and can go years just continuing to make content everywhere but the United States. And then you have the legacy studios who are going to be in big trouble if they don't start making more movies soon, because they're going to run out of, fourth quarter, theatrical releases and, whatever it is. So I don't see how they're all getting along with each other because they have very different needs.
Interesting. Yeah. It's such a big thing. Wow. Yeah. Well, what is I ask the same two questions at the end of every podcast. What's your biggest defect of character?
Me? Crippling neurotic anxiety.
Really?
I think so. Yeah.
You seem pretty chill.
No, that's just a demeanor. I over-worry everything. I over-worry every little thing when I get off this Zoom. I'm going to over-worry that I spoke too much and said things I shouldn't have said about the union or about the studios. Everything I just constant concern that nothing is ever going to work out because, of something. So, yeah. that and when it's really riding me, I'm actually really unpleasant to be around. So it's I can't always contain it. Sometimes I'm just a tense mess because I had a bad day at work and because I think some deal's not going to get made or something. So, and I think
Yep.
that's probably what I'm describing is maybe not unique to writers in particular. To Jewish writers, definitely. I think we're all just built with a certain. So I've got it both genetically and because of my profession that I'm just. I think I sweat the small stuff in a really big way. So.
And what's your biggest asset?
Probably the same thing. Probably just the fact that I so scared of turning in a script that they won't like or turning in something inferior that I overdo it and I work extra hard on it and I do way more revisions on it. Like I don't feel now I've been doing this for 15 years. I've run 3 shows. I've had a bunch of movies made, and I still feel like the next thing I hand in is going to be a piece of shit, and everyone's going to stop working with me. And that's just, Jewish writers.
Yes. Also Hollywood, that's not an unreasonable.
You're only as good as your last thing.
Yep.
For sure.
I had a child actor best friend growing up, and I'll never forget him saying that to me. You're only as good as your last project in this town. I was like, ow, Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in that sense, for writers, it's a little better because the same reason, a lot of writers are bitter that they could spend 3 years writing a movie and then a director makes it and it's the director's movie, right? It's the director gets all the credit for the movie and the writers kind of, we're the bottom of, we're definitely the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to actor, director, writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the plus side to that is the directors also take the blame, right? Like in success, it's their movie, and in failure, it's their movie. And if I wrote a movie that didn't perform well, which I've done, executives still might think that was an amazing script and I'll still get hired again. And it's just a shame that, they screwed up the movie, but it was a good script.
Right.
You do have a level of insulation.
Right. Interesting.
So screener in that sense, you're, as a showrunner, less so. If you put out a real dog of a show, you're kind of the director of that, right? But in general, the one plus side to us being at the bottom of the totem pole is we do have a little bit of insulation because everyone else is busy taking credit for our work. So they also have to take the blame for it.
Right. A double-edged sword. Well, it's been a pleasure getting to know you and talking to you about all of this. And if you do, I'm just excited about the success of the show and I hope you get another season. And
I think we will. Selfishly. I have heard it's performing really well on the platform. No one's giving us data, obviously, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful we'll get a 4th season. Josh and Evan will run it. I do think we have at least 1 or 2 more seasons left of story to tell. And it's been so exciting getting to a bigger fan base. Like it's great that you found it on Cinemax, but most people didn't. Most people found it now. And they did tell me at Max that the amount of people going back and watching seasons 1 and 2 now is huge, which is great for us because, we were always, it's just great to find an audience finally for that show.
Yeah. It's so good. I hope people, I mean, it's funny too, because I went home and saw some people are always like, what should I watch? What should I watch? And I'm like, Warrior. And they're like, what's that? I'm like, how have you not heard about this show? Especially my young, it was my 18-year-old and 22-year-old nephews. I'm like, you guys would love this show. Are you kidding me? So they're going to watch it.
Good. 2 more.
So I'm spreading the word. Yes. 2 more. Just mark it down. You're keeping track of everyone. So since the studios won't tell you.
Yes. I'm hoarding the data.
Where can we find you? Is there anywhere? Are you on? I don't know if you're on social media or if you just want to pitch
I'm not
Warrior.
The best social media person. I mean, no one's going to get excited about my Instagram and Twitter. I don't really tweet. I haven't tweeted in years. It's too angry a place for me. I still have my account there, I think, but I don't really visit it.
Smart. That's how I know you're smart.
Yeah, and then I think I'm on Instagram. I'm not hard to find, but I'm also not a very sexy account. But Warriors on Max, and we love that show. And I don't really have anything to plug. I just wanted to come on and talk to you. So
Yeah, this has been great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really great to meet you in person.
There's no check-in this week because we're on vacation. Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank our composer, Jared Elias, my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.